So it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Milan Spolik is a professor at Yale, and he's a leading expert on authoritarianism and democratization. He's the author of a prize-winning book on the politics of authoritarian rule. He regularly publishes in the best journals in the discipline. He's been working on what I think is one of the most critical issues of our time, and that is, why do ordinary people continue to support politicians who subvert democratic norms and democratic institutions? So one of his most recent articles in APSR reached the conclusion, sad conclusion I think, that most Americans are partisans first and Democrats only second. And given what's happening south of the border right now, I don't think his talk today could be more timely. So how do voters react when a governing party refuses to accept the results of an election? So I'm sure there are lessons that will transfer to other settings facing similar problems. So it's up to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And so I'm excited to be able to present and share my research with you. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Given the time frame for the talk, I will skip some parts of what I have prepared, some of the technical parts. And so please let me know after the talk if you would like me to return to any of the slides. And so I'm going to share my screen with the slides. And I would like to start with a case that will motivate, and basically that I will try to examine throughout this talk. And that is an event that happened in the March of 2019 during local elections, and in this case specifically in the mayoral race in Istanbul in March 2019. This was a race in which the governing AKP party that controls the national government in Turkey, but has also controlled the control of the Istanbul municipality for the last 20 years, was running a former prime minister, Binali Yildirim, from the AKP, against an opposition candidate, Ekrem İmamoğlu, from the opposition CHP. This election is fascinating because at first, it looked like the AKP is going to win. On the night of the election, it was barely leading in the vote count. Then the vote count stopped, and on the morning of the next day, it was announced that, in fact, by the margin of about 14,000 votes, the victory actually went to the opposition candidate, Ekrem İmamoğlu. This was a big defeat for the governing AKP. For many reasons. Istanbul is the largest city in Turkey. It's the economic center of Turkey. It's a huge source of tax revenue. And for political reasons, it's also a huge source of patronage. And it also has a symbolic meaning. This is where President Erdogan, the Turkish president, started his political career as the mayor of Istanbul. What happened next will be essentially key to the talk that I'm giving, and that is that rather than conceding, the AKP has filed complaints and lawsuits with the Turkish Electoral Commission, the YSK. And after a couple of weeks, the YSK has ordered, for the first time in Turkish history, a rerun of the whole election. But now this rerun happened in June 2019, and this time the AKP not only lost by a few thousand votes, it lost big time. It was overwhelmingly defeated with a difference of more than 800,000 as opposed to just a few thousand votes. For me, this case, this election, represents a unique opportunity to find out when is it that incumbent attempts to undermine democracy fail. And so there's a couple of questions that I would like to ask about this specific case, and broadly about the nature of democratic backsliding and the public resistance to incumbents who undermine democracy. And let me maybe still staying very specifically with this case, ask the following question. So the first question that I would like to ask is, how is it that Istanbulites defeated the AKP's attempt to overturn this election? And in principle, there could be at least three ways in which the huge difference between the March and the June vote could have resulted. The first that we usually examine when we study democratic backsliding and when we think of voters rejecting incumbents is vote switching. That is literally, in this case, that somebody who in March has voted for the AKP, by June has seen that the AKP has behaved undemocratically and decided, this time I am voting for the opposition CHP. And the way I am denoting this here is in this table, I'm showing three outcomes: the vote for the AKP, the vote for the CHP, and abstention, the three major available actions to the voters in this election. And if indeed vote switching happened, then what we would observe in the data from this election is a decline in the AKP's vote share. That's the negative delta V that I'm showing in that first row. An increase in the CHP's vote share, so that's that positive delta V, but no shift in turnout. Crucially, there are also two other ways in which voters can punish incumbents who undermine democracy that we don't examine as often. And these entail shifts in turnout. And the first of these I call backlash. This is when somebody who previously abstained decides to turn out and votes, in this case, for the opposition, for the pro-democratic side in the contest. And so this kind of outcomes that we should observe in that case, if we observe backlash happening, is that we should observe no change in the vote for the governing AKP, but an increase in the vote share for the CHP and a decrease in abstention rates, or in other words, an increase in turnout. And finally, a third way in which voters could punish undemocratic behavior is that those who previously supported the governing AKP decide to this time stay at home. They decide to abstain. And so the way we would observe it in the data in this table, again, is shown by a decline in the vote for the AKP, an increase in abstention rates, and crucially, no change in the vote for the CHP. And so the one task that I'm giving myself for this paper is to figure out which of these three mechanisms that voters in Istanbul use to punish the AKP for attempting to overturn the result of the election. And what's at stake here is that it leads to a better understanding of whether persuasion, mobilization, or potentially demobilization are the most viable instruments for curbing incumbents with authoritarian ambitions. The second question that I would like to ask is, who punished the AKP for undermining democracy? And to give you some background, Turkey, as you know, is a prominent case of democratic backsliding. Electoral competition takes place between two sharply opposed blocs, the governing AKP and the opposition CHP. The two formed coalitions that ran candidates in this election. According to many of the accounts that we have, both qualitative and survey-based, this is a highly polarized electorate. And crucially, way before this election, the AKP and President Erdogan already have a history of undermining democracy. Just to give you a few examples, the government in Turkey routinely abuses anti-terrorism laws to prosecute journalists and opponents. Turkey is one of the countries with the largest number of journalists in prison. A prominent case that got a lot of attention, or prominent undemocratic step in this case, was when the Turkish government violently suppressed protests, the so-called Gezi Park protests in Istanbul in 2013. After the failed military coup in 2016, the government purged, the AKP purged the government bureaucracy, the judiciary, and the military of suspected disloyalists. And finally, maybe the last and most prominent step was in 2017, it held a referendum on a shift to a presidential system. And that referendum was held under highly one-sided circumstances when the government used all of its power to campaign in favor of changing the constitution, whereas the opposition was highly limited in its ability to affect the outcome. The reason why I'm listing these cases is that if you are a voter in Istanbul in March 2019, you have already seen all of this. So if you are voting for the AKP, you have already factored all of these undemocratic tendencies of the AKP government in, which only makes sharper the question, or more interesting the question, who is it that in June 2019 that decides that this time, after the AKP attempted to overturn an election that it lost, that this time they have gone too far? Who are the 800,000 Istanbulites that were there, who in March were thinking, I'm still with the AKP, but after the AKP attempts to overturn an election that it lost, they decide, and this time I'm acting differently. I'm either switching my vote, or I'm staying at home if I voted for the AKP previously, or I'm turning out to vote, whereas I previously abstained. And one way to think about this is that we will get an answer to the question, who is it that puts democratic principles above partisan interests? And let me briefly highlight the kind of evidence that I would like to review in the talk. So first of all, I will treat this case of the Istanbul mayoral race as a natural experiment. And I will explain in a minute why I think it offers an almost quasi-experimental setting to address the questions that I just outlined. I will also present some evidence from survey experiments that I conducted in Turkey in 2019, just after this mayoral race, and then a year before that. And also some evidence from pre-election surveys and traditional surveys. And the questions, again, that I will try to answer is, did voters in Istanbul indeed punish the AKP government's undemocratic behavior? If they did, how did they punish it? Was it by vote switching, by backlash, or by disenchantment? And crucially, who is it that punished that undemocratic behavior? What kind of citizen is it that decides to defect or change their vote when they observe their favorite candidate to behave undemocratically? So first, let me clarify why I think this is a quasi-experiment. What we have in Istanbul is a large electorate of 11 million voters that within the scope of 3 months got to vote twice, choosing between in the same race, choosing between the same set of candidates, and crucially, with the only major difference between the two races, that in between the two races, the governing party attempted to overturn the result of the election, exerting undue pressure on the Electoral Commission. And so we have, what I would like to say here is that basically what we see is that we can causally, very plausibly claim that the major thing that changed between March 2019 and between June 9, 2019 is that the voter in Istanbul saw that the AKP is willing this time to go so far, further than that it has previously dared to go, and that is to overturn a result of an election. Before getting to the empirics, let me very briefly highlight how I think about this kind of behavior on the voter side theoretically. And what I will do is propose a very simple theoretical framework, building on some of my work, both solo and jointly with Matt Graham, that thinks of voters' resistance or opposition to undemocratic behavior as a valence attribute in a very simple model of voter choice. So here I'm showing you how I think about the citizens' payoffs from voting for candidates. And it's, as you can see, it's the standard quadratic distance payoff where voters have spatial preferences. So here Uij is voter I's payoff from candidate J. And that payoff consists of this spatial payoff where Xi is voters' favorite policy, Xj is candidate J's platform. And that square distance simply indicates that the voter would like the candidate to be as close as possible to her ideal point. And the term alpha before the brackets there is the weight that the voter puts on policies, or loosely speaking, partisanship in her payoff. And the crucial difference between standard models of vote choice here is this D minus term with the delta before it that denotes the voters' dislike for undemocratic behavior by politicians. So in other words, what I'm doing here is treating undemocratic behavior by a candidate as something that all voters agree that they dislike. So D minus is in the analysis that I will show will simply correspond to either the node being 1 or 0. When it's 1, then the candidate is behaving undemocratically. When it's 0, it's missing from this expression for the voters' payoff. And the delta term is a key term of interest because that delta term determines how much the voter cares about democracy relative to policy or other interests that she might have. Now, the main implication of this assumption will be that strong partisans or voters who feel strongly about policies will be willing to sacrifice democratic principles for voting for candidates that they really like. But crucially, because in this setup, I also want to examine turnout, I need to make some assumptions about how preferences for candidates will turn into turnout behavior. And so I will adopt a very simple behavioral assumption, and that is that voters like turning out for candidates when they see a big difference between their favorite candidate and the alternative. So here, what this first payoff is summarizing is basically saying that the payoff from voting for citizen I who prefers candidate 1 to candidate 2, when candidate J wins, is simply that utility from that candidate J. Plus, and now comes the only difference from a standard models, is that I'm assuming that there is a payoff rho that is an expressive utility that the voter gets, and that expressive utility is increasing in the difference she sees between her favorite candidate and the alternative. So that's the expressive payoff that she gets from turning out. And minus C is the standard cost of voting that we have in models of turnout. Alternatively, if the voter does not turn out, if she abstains, then and candidate J wins, then she simply gets how much she values the payoff from that candidate. So a combination of these two assumptions has the following implication for the case that I want to examine. So the first one is that we will observe voters and abstainers. And abstainers will be voters who feel close to indifferent between the two candidates. Those are the voters for whom turning out is not worth it because they don't see much of a difference between the two candidates. And the range of those voters here is delineated by that space between minus A and A in this graph. And think of what I'm plotting here as the scenario in Istanbul in March, when both parties were competing against each other, but before the AKP attempted to overturn the result of the election. So let me now outline how this translates into the implications of who in Istanbul will be switching their vote, who will be backlashing under my definition, or who will be a disenchanted voter. So this next line plots the shift associated with the decrease in support for the AKP candidate because that candidate has undermined democracy. We see that now that region of abstention has moved to the right. It means that many more voters are now voting for the CHP. There's still an abstention rate, and there are still some voters who, in spite of the AKP behaving undemocratically, are still voting for the AKP. So let me now highlight the three groups of voters that we should observe. And the first is the set of voters who will engage in backlash. Recall that these are the voters who previously abstained, which you can see on the top line, but now they're in the region that's turning out to vote for the CHP. So this is our expectation about backlash. Then the next set of voters are voters who previously voted for the AKP, but they are now voting for the CHP. So these voters are switching their vote. And finally, there's the subset of the voters who previously voted for the AKP, but they are now abstaining. This is disenchantment in my terminology. So in other words, what we have is a prediction about how one's intensity or nature of support for the two candidates translates into whether that voter should primarily engage in backlash, in vote switching, or in disenchantment. Those who mostly supported the CHP or were indifferent will mostly engage in backlash. Those who were supporters of the AKP will mainly engage in disenchantment, and those in the middle will be vote switching. And this is the prediction that I will now take to the data. So first, the data from Istanbul. And so let me maybe to start, draw your attention to the orange line at the bottom. This is the AKP two-party vote share. And to be more precise, this is the difference between June and March 2019 in the AKP two-party vote share. And on the horizontal axis, I am pooling all neighborhoods in Istanbul by their two-party vote share in March. So to explain what I mean here is that on the horizontal axis, you basically have the intensity of support for the governing party, the AKP. And on the vertical axis, you have the difference between March and June. And as you can see, the orange line is in the negative range the whole time, meaning the AKP was losing voters everywhere. But crucially, the two-party vote share appears to be suffering most in the middle, as if voters in the middle were defecting from the AKP the most. This will turn out not to be the case. And the reason is because a change in the AKP vote share, just like I outlined earlier, could occur for multiple reasons. It could be either because voters were switching from the AKP to the CHP, or it could be because some voters who previously abstained are now turning out, but for the CHP, or it could be the other way around, that former AKP voters are now staying at home. And to get a hint of what's going on, look at these other curves. And the first one I would like to highlight is the vote for the CHP, the opposition party. And as you can see, that one, so that's the shift in the vote, and that shift is the largest and positive in CHP strongholds. So where the AKP is the strongest, the weakest, we see the largest positive shift in favor of the opposition. And this red curve is declining so that it's smallest but still positive in AKP strongholds. Now, why is this vote for the CHP increasing so much? So the next line I would like to point to is this blue dotted line that plots the changes in abstentions. And so what you see is on the far left, the change in abstention is negative, which means turnout was increasing. And this would indicate that in these neighborhoods that are on the far left, these are the opposition strongholds, what's really happening is that the opposition is simply turning out at a much higher rate. We see a simultaneous increase in the vote for the opposition and a simultaneous decrease in abstentions. Something opposite happens at the other end. So the black line in this graph is the vote for the governing AKP. We see it drop low on the far right end. And we also see abstentions increase in this region of the graph. So in other words, what you see is a simultaneous decrease in turnout and a simultaneous decrease in the vote for the governing party, which would exactly indicate that now those who have previously voted for the AKP are staying at home. And vote switching could be happening throughout this graph, but here at least we have some indication that in the opposition stronghold, people were primarily acting by backlash, turning out in higher numbers than previously for the opposition. In the government strongholds, we observe disenchantment, that is, people are staying at home who previously voted for the governing AKP. And vote switching could be happening everywhere. And I will get in a minute to where I think it's happening the most. So I will now go through two tests, statistical tests, of what mechanisms are most likely happening. Due to time constraints, let me briefly highlight that each of these tests is trying to deal with a different aggregation problem. When you're looking at a graph like this, I'm aggregating at the level of neighborhood subgroups by the support for the AKP. And so what could be happening is that the correlations that you observe at this level could be just artifacts of aggregation, and both aggregation of neighborhoods into subgroups or of individuals into neighborhoods. And I have a somewhat ad hoc of dealing with this aggregation problem, but in the interest of time, I will skip the technical aspects and simply give you what I have in terms of the estimates of the three mechanisms for the case of Istanbul. And this is what I estimate. And I will be happy to answer questions about how exactly I estimate this in the Q&A. So here in this graph, the horizontal axis is exactly as before, but now I'm showing you the estimated degree of vote switching, backlash, and disenchantment. And so the red line highlights backlash. So you can see, as previously indicated by the raw data, I am estimating that most backlash happened in the opposition strongholds. This is the left end of this graph. And the least of it happened on the right in government strongholds. Vote switching, this is the black line, happened primarily in the middle, that is moderate precincts, moderate districts. Voters were actually switching their vote. And there's only a limited amount of disenchantment, but when it is positive and significant, it is in government strongholds. This is where the strong supporters of the AKP, some of them in the rerun of this election, were staying at home. So this is the first kind of data that I examined. The great advantage of this data is that it's the actual real world population, real world candidates, and actions of interest. If we want to stop incumbents who undermine democracy, real people have to turn out and vote against those candidates. It approximates a natural experiment in that it was the same election in the same context, rerun twice, with one major difference between the two runs, and that is that one candidate attempted to overturn the outcome of the election. But it also has some limitations, and the primary ones is that the data comes aggregated. We never observe individual level data that ultimately the mechanisms are about. And you could also have questions about causality. This is not really an experiment, this is pre and post, and you could claim that some other factors may have been confounding what I'm calling the primary cause of this change, which is that the governing party attempted to overturn the election. So let me show you some evidence now from survey experiments that attempt to get at some of the weaknesses of the real case. What I did in 2018 and 2019, I administered to a representative sample of Turks a series of candidate choice experiments where the main idea was that these candidates, in the spirit of conjoined experiments, were described by real world attributes like their economic policy, social policy, sometimes there were valence attributes and party affiliations. But the crucial difference that I was interested in between the control and the treatment condition was that one of the candidates was randomly assigned to propose something that is undemocratic. And in the Turkish context, that was that the candidate either said that we should fire government employees who do not support our party, or that we should cut government spending in districts that did not vote for our party. And let me briefly show you the results from one experiment that very closely mirrored the Istanbul context. This was an experiment that was introduced by the statement, in an election, we rarely get to vote for the perfect candidate. Suppose you were given the choice between the following two candidates for parliament in your district. Who would you vote for? In the control condition, the candidate was simply described by some personal attributes, age, gender, and profession. And then the only other thing that there was their party affiliation. Either the candidate was from the AKP, or it was from the opposition CHP or the E party, which in this contest, the Istanbul contest, was a coalition partner of the CHP. What this control condition allows me to do is to figure out who, as a baseline, supports the AKP versus the CHP. And now in the treatment condition, the AKP, the government candidate, also said the following: we should fire government employees who do not support our party. And so what I'm interested in here is to figure out who is it that after the government candidate endorses an undemocratic position like this one, is going to actually switch or change their behavior, either switch their vote or potentially change whether they are turning out or not to vote. And here's one result. So in this graph, I'm plotting the control and the treatment condition. And the outcome here is simply the vote for the AKP candidate. The black line shows you the control. And so the horizontal axis is organized by the respondents' approval for President Erdogan as opposed to the opposition candidate Imamoglu. So the nice logit shaped shape of the control condition simply says, the more you like Erdogan, the more likely you're going to vote for the AKP, exactly what you would expect. But now the blue dashed line is the treatment condition. This is what happens when the only difference between the two candidates, the two scenarios, is that now the AKP candidate is endorsing something undemocratic. We see a large decline in the AKP candidate's vote share. But now the key question is, what's happening? Are voters vote switching to the CHP, or are they engaging in something different? And so here's one indication. This graph plots the same two experimental conditions, but now it's the vote for the CHP candidate. And we indeed see a small increase in the vote for the CHP candidate. You can see this because the blue line is above the black line, but it's nowhere as close as that large decline in the AKP candidates associated with the same change between the two conditions. In other words, what's happening is the main action is actually in turnout behavior. So here I'm showing you what happened to voters' abstention decisions. The black line shows what happened in the control condition. Note especially that the strong supporters of Erdogan on the right hand of this graph had close to 0 abstentions. In other words, they were turning out at a really high rate. And now, if the AKP candidate becomes undemocratic, the blue line, they're abstaining at a much higher rate. So in other words, this would indicate that the main insight from the survey experiment is that when voters are punishing undemocratic behavior, they are doing it through primarily, in this case, vote switching and disenchantment. Especially the right-hand side of this graph indicates strong supporters of Erdogan are unwilling to vote for the opposition, but they may be willing to stay at home and simply not turn out when the AKP does something undemocratic. And using a methodology that I used in the previous case, this shows the share of the 3 mechanisms. Overall, it's primarily vote switching and disenchantment with very little backlash. But note that in spite of some differences, there are some similarities to what happened previously. The red line is backlash, and just like previously, it's strongest among the supporters of the opposition. The blue line is disenchantment, and just like previously, it's strongest among the supporters of the government. And vote switching appears to be highest in the middle. So I am close to running out of time, and let me just say that conclude maybe by highlighting one aspect of this data and preview the next data that I probably won't get a chance to look at. So the advantage of this data is that I actually experimentally manipulated something that I was interested in. That is, what happens if a candidate behaves undemocratically? I have rich individual level covariates, and so I can tell you more about who is it from this data that punishes undemocratic behavior. And it was also timed well. It was executed both a year before this contentious election that I started with, and also in its immediate aftermath. But there are some limitations, and one is that these are survey-based measures of outcomes. So whereas when I was examining the actual Istanbul data, I was talking about real world behavior and real people actually turning out to vote against a government that behaves undemocratically. In this case, I'm simply asking people what they would do. And in a regime like Turkey, that may not be as reliable as working with actual behavior. Just like previously, this is actually aggregate data, meaning I have individual behavior, but the experimental conditions are aggregated. And there are somewhat different populations and candidates, meaning this is an experiment administered to a representative sample of Turks, whereas previously we were dealing with Istanbul. And the candidates here are artificial, whereas previously these were real world candidates. The final source of data that I'm trying to look at to examine this question is an actual survey that was conducted between the 2 elections, where voters were asked how they voted in March in this election and their vote intention in June in this election. And so here I can reconstruct the exact matrix of what was happening between the elections. So what I'm showing you, the joint distribution is the joint distribution of behavior. So you can see that 35 roughly 35% of individuals voted for the AKP in both elections, roughly 40% voted for the CHP in both elections, and roughly 10% abstained. But the rest of this joint distribution speaks to the three mechanisms that I tried to highlight. And just very briefly, we observe significant vote switching, so roughly 2.35%. Also a significant amount of backlash, roughly 3.4%, and some disenchantment. And I'm rushing through this because I don't want to run past my allotted time, and I'd be happy to talk more about this. But the main conclusion here is that we observe a pattern that is roughly consistent with what came out of the two other sources of data. And maybe to conclude on a more substantive topic, we see throughout these data that voters punish about just as much by changing their turnout behavior, especially backlash, as they punish by vote switching. And so this to me indicates that when we think about when is it and how the public can act as a check on incumbents with undemocratic tendencies, we need to focus about equally on persuasion and who is changing their vote, as much as on turnout and who is both turning out to vote that otherwise wouldn't, but also crucially, who may be acting through disenchantment, that is staying at home when they otherwise would vote for the party that's behaving undemocratically. Maybe a final point that I would like to conclude with, this whole case, the case of the Istanbul 2019 election, to me shows a very interesting case of when institutions that were supposed to guard democracy, in this case, the Electoral Commission of Turkey, failed because it was pressured ultimately by President Erdogan and the AKP to order a rerun of election that was perfectly clean. But crucially, the public managed to defeat this attempt by overwhelmingly voting against the AKP. So this is in the case where institutions fail, but the public succeeds as a democratic check. I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have time for questions. So I'd ask people to use the show your hand up function, or you can send a chat, and be sure to unmute when you ask a question. Ah, I see. Ben Forrest.
Yeah, here I am. Hi, thanks very much for an extremely interesting talk. This is really a very general question. You focused on the issue of democratic backsliding, but I mean, with the model you presented, or the situation you presented, I mean, presumably that could be applied to sort of any action that a party takes that is seen as undesirable. And it's sort of not limited to sort of anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say? And if so, is there anything sort of unique about democratic, sort of anti-democratic behavior?
So, thanks for your question. And so in the model that I presented, I explicitly treated undemocratic actions by politicians as a negative valence attribute in effect. And so as long as there's a category of behaviors that we think of as negative valence, corruption, right? Or in these experiments, some of these candidates were described by a positive valence attribute. They were describing as candidates who have reduced crime in their neighborhood. Then I think about democracy in a very similar way, or I think we should think about voters as thinking about democracy in a similar manner. Maybe the one key distinction that emerges is some of the estimates from both experiments in Turkey, but also in the United States, but this is something that you would expect, is that there's an interaction effect between that valence attribute and one's partisanship. And what that interaction effect does is basically say, people use a double standard, that when it's my side that's doing it, I don't discount it as heavily as when it is the other side that is doing it. So in other words, this actually seems to somewhat contradict my initial point that it's a pure valence attribute. It's a partial valence attribute. I can show empirically that everybody dislikes undemocratic behavior. but that dislike is, the intensity of that dislike is also a function of partisan proximity to the candidate. I'm not sure whether this is what you were looking for in terms of an answer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Samra.
Okay, hi, Professor. I just wanted to start off by saying that I really liked your presentation. I also really liked the case study. I think it's a bit refreshing to hear backsliding happening in another country other than the United States. I'm also quite impressed with your knowledge of Turkish politics and the sort of I guess background information you gave leading up to your analysis was great. One thing that I would add on as another example to your examples that you gave that I think is quite revealing as well is perhaps you've heard, but there was a situation where the Prime Minister Erdogan was revealed, there was leaked videos that came out showing him, or they were tapes actually, that had him instructing his son-in-law how to hide millions of dollars. And this went kind of viral in Turkey. And this was in light, I think it was around 2014. So leading up to the many examples that you provided that were really good, I think this one is another one that was quite widespread, and I would add in your narrative. But other than that, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit more about the survey that happened between the two elections. Is it my understanding that you were involved in that survey, or this is an external survey that you're using for this study? But if you can talk a little bit more about that survey, I'd really appreciate it. My only worry is that I feel like because so many people are worried about responding to things accurately in Turkey, whether it's because they think that if they tweet about a problem that they will, the next day they'll have a knock on the door and they'll be going to prison or whatnot. I'm just wondering what type of people responded to that survey, because I think that people people in Turkey at least, they tend to filter their true views about things. So just wondering how if there's any way to control for that, or if you can talk more about that survey, greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks for your comments. Thanks for a tip about Erdogan and his son-in-law. I mean, his son-in-law seems to be just repeatedly a disappointment. It's rumored that he was behind one of the people who were behind this rerun, that he was telling him that rerunning this election, he could win it the second time, right? And then he's the finance minister. I don't know what else. So he's failing on multiple grounds. But about the survey. So this survey, I actually did not conduct it. I conducted multiple surveys with survey experiments, but I did not have enough foresight to know that this election would be rerun to run this survey myself. And I've blamed myself so many times for not seeing it happening. This is a proprietary survey that I essentially bought from the survey agency. I don't want to name them just because I will ultimately have to name them when I publish the paper, but for some of the reasons, I don't want to name them just yet. And this is one of the major Turkish survey agencies. And when they were predicting the result of the March election, they were spot on, and the same for the June election. So at least based on their record of properly, reporting who will win and by what percentage, they seem to be doing pretty well. But now, when I got access to this data, I thought, oh, this is great, because I'm using all these fancy statistics to try to infer from aggregate electoral results how people were actually acting, whether they were vote switching, whether they were actually staying at home, whereas previously they were voting. I don't know what else, right? Here, it's right in the data because I observed the individual voter and how she voted in March and how she's telling me she's going to vote in June. Except, as you would imagine with a survey like this, there are some people who will tell you they're still undecided. And then there are, or who don't, there are two major problems. There are people who are undecided. And so given how many people tend to be undecided, and given what the switch was in this election, that can actually shift big time the ultimate reported quantities of these three mechanisms that I'm after: vote switching, disenchantment, and backlash. And crucially, the second, that all Turkish survey agencies have a really hard time, just like anywhere else in the world, surveying people who abstain a lot. And since the key mechanisms here that I'm trying to investigate also relate to shifts in turnout behavior, I can tell you that this survey undersamples abstainers in a ratio about 1 out of 3. And so what we have to rely on is that the people that they do detect and that tell them I am abstaining, that they are representative of the other 2/3 who we know are abstaining, but we don't have in a sample. And Turkey, because it has a compulsory voting, that abstainer is a very specific kind of abstainer. It's a very special kind of citizens. So these are the two doubts that I have about this data. And whereas before I accessed it, I thought, and this data is going to just be the final answer to everything. After carefully working with it, I'm thinking all three sources of data are roughly speaking with the same soundness to this question.
Hi, Olivier.
Hi, Professor Svolik. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering how the decision to hold the new election came about, and specifically whether or not there was some sort of a legitimation of the anti-democratic behavior through the judiciary or the courts, which would facilitate motivated reasoning on the part of the AKP voters who might say, well, this is actually not anti-democratic. It went through the courts, or it went through some other institution that legitimized it.
Yes. So if you read the opinions in Turkish newspapers around this time, in pro-government newspapers, this is how they did justify it. They justified it as this is a victory for democracy. We had suspicions that this election was manipulated. So what was wrong with this election according to the complaint? I didn't get to it, but really what happened the parallels to the 2020 US election are just kind of striking, especially to Georgia, in the following sense. There was nothing wrong with this election other than that the AKP lost, and it lost very narrowly. Then it discovered that in many of the precinct level commissions, the individuals who were serving on these commissions weren't state employees as mandated by law, which has been a long-standing practice in Turkey, in part because it's really hard to get people to serve on these commissions. And so they filed a complaint with the Turkish Electoral Commission, the YSK, for these irregularities. There were even some recounts that didn't really discover anything. But crucially, they filed it with the highest instance of the Electoral Commission, which also acts as its own court. So basically it rules, and its members are what would be the equivalent of a federal judge in Turkey. And they ruled in favor of the AKP. But in the meantime, a lower instance at the level of Istanbul of this commission actually officially inaugurated Imamoglu as the mayor of the mayor of Istanbul, right? So a lower instance was basically respecting the outcome of the election. And meanwhile, a case is happening at the national level. And that level of the commission ultimately orders a rerun. But crucially, orders a rerun only in the Istanbul mayoral race, not the other races that were happening at the same time. So for instance, at the same time, there were races for the city council, and of course, races across Turkey. And the government still interpreted this as like, this is a victory for democracy. There was an election that was imperfect. We get to rerun it, and we will see, the truth will come out. In spite of all of this, I am not I'm not convinced motivated reasoning is the right framework here. And that's for multiple reasons. One is that I would agree that people may have different sources of information. And so if I'm an Istanbulite who primarily reads the pro-government press, then I may be getting information that indicates, yes, the election was actually improperly administered and was justly ordered to be rerun, which I would read as very distinct from motivated reasoning. But when we look, for instance, at the survey experiments that I conducted, there I don't see much room for motivated reasoning, right? There I'm telling the voter, the respondent clearly, and this candidate is saying X. So they clearly see X. And crucially, what I do in these experiments, before I administer them, I actually try to pre-measure how good the respondent is at differentiating between democratic and undemocratic behavior. And the way I do it is that I on purpose ask, we observe all kinds of political behavior around the world. I would like you to tell me whether these actions taken in other countries, according to you, are democratic or not. And then I gave in a very generic language, I get examples like, you know, the governing party attempted to overturn the result of an election that it lost, you know, but I on purpose do it in another country because I know that people often, when given examples from their own country, will give answers that then are, I wouldn't say partisan, you know, are not motivated, don't necessarily show examples of motivated reasoning, but definitely show examples of motivated responding. Right? They will respond in a politically biased manner, trying to present their side in a more virtuous light. So I guess you asked about motivated reasoning. I gave you a very long answer, but I am throughout these projects, I'm trying to figure out what would be good evidence that would allow me to differentiate something like motivated reasoning from something like a voter who's voting for the AKP saying, yeah, I saw them doing something undemocratic, but they also do a lot of stuff that I like, and so I'm going to vote for them. In other words, I'm making a conscious trade-off where I'm in my actions disregarding the undemocratic behavior because ultimately other things that the party does for me prevail.
Thank you. Angus.
Just put video on there. Hi, thanks so much for a great presentation. Looking forward to reading the paper. I think it's a super interesting case study. I wasn't aware of it and of the double election, so certainly going to look more into that. I'm curious about the valence issue language and just sort of thinking that through a little bit because, and you know, maybe I'm off base here, but it looks like basically the number of votes cast for the AKP was similar in the two elections. I mean, they lost whatever 150,000 votes or something. So I know you've talked about sort of the, you know, partisanship really changing the way you perceive these things, but it just strikes me that it's sort of hard to talk about a valence issue when so few of the electorate seem to actually care about this sort of thing. And of course, I'm more familiar with the American context, and of course, I'm thinking about Trump when I ask this question. So, you know, I apologize because it must be infuriating that you get questions about Trump all the time. But how is it a valence issue if so few people seem to actually care about it? I guess that's sort of my question in short.
Thank you. I mean, so I think it's a really important question, and really, I would, you know, encourage any questions about this aspect, because this has been the basic building block of some of these studies that I've done. And I guess one way that I'm seeing this is if you look at that payoff function that I showed earlier, what the valence attribute implies is that you do dislike undemocratic behavior. But if you either have strong preferences or are a strong partisan, then those may weigh more heavily in your decision between candidates. So in other words, what would be some evidence that this is a valence issue if in some of these experimental graphs that I've shown you where you had a logit-shaped curve, if there was a uniform shift downward or upward associated with undemocratic behavior. And we observe it for some subsets of those curves, right? So that would indicate that indeed everybody dislikes it somewhat, but some parts of the electorate weigh it more heavily than others. And here in the Turkish case, I don't have as strong evidence as in the US case, where in a joint work with Matt Graham, we actually show that if you do this to the US electorate, then the group that punishes the most are the moderates. And the tails of the distribution of both ends, strong Democrats or strong Republicans, punish much less. And this would be, I would see this as consistent with the valence proposition in the following sense, that if you're a strong partisan, you say, yeah, I dislike it, just like in my previous answer, but because I really like the candidate on policy X, I'm willing to live with it. You know, I'm holding my nose and voting for that candidate. And so I think a true evidence experimentally for the valence attribute comes in the sense that in any subset of the electorate, we observe a slight decline in support for the candidates behaving undemocratically. But crucially, the extent of that decline is also a function of partisanship. Those who are the least partisans punish the most, and those who are the most partisans punish less and less, but still punish somewhat. And I see that as consistent with that proposition. That is, you both care about spatial issues, but also about valence issues. And, you know, just like with other valence issues, like corruption or, you know, personal misdemeanor, whatever that would be, right? People are willing to tolerate it if that candidate delivers something else. So I guess that would be my sort of, you know, explication of my approach to this. But I would love to hear on, you know, if you think I'm getting that valence part wrong, or what would be an alternative to the valence part, I would love suggestions on that.
I mean, I think I buy your explanation generally. I just struggle a little bit with this very weak effect on the tails as you describe it, and still wanting to call it a valence issue. It seems to me, again, just in the United States case, that there is a large segment of the population that actually does not care at all about it. Now, it might just be that partisanship is so strong that, you know, the coefficient on that is undetectable, and maybe they still care. Like if you really sat them down and you pushed them and you said, like, do you like this behavior? No, okay, but, you know, it won't change your vote. Maybe, but it might also be that there is a segment of the population that doesn't care at all about this issue. And I think that in sort of the democratic backsliding literature, that is particularly dangerous. It's when like those norms get eroded, and so this is no longer a valence issue, and that some sizable segment of the population, like a large enough segment of the population, no longer considers it as part of their vote calculus. I don't know if that's what's happening here, but that to me is the real danger. But maybe that's not true, and maybe there is still a little bit of movement, so we're okay.
So maybe I would, so one difference, and now that you're mentioning this, I think that there could be, is when we examining vote choices, it's often, as in the US context, a binary choice, right? You really have to make a stark choice. Matt Graham, my co-author on my US paper, and I have recently conducted a study where instead of asking people to choose between candidates, we asked them to donate money to two different groups. We gave each respondent 10 cents, you know, in a survey, and said, divide these 10 cents. And crucially, we asked them to do it between two groups that were on the same side as they were politically, but one was sort of doing democratically the right thing, for instance, opposing gerrymandering, and the other side was doing democratically the wrong thing, supporting gerrymandering. And there we observe a continuous outcome. So the 10 cents, you can divide it in 11 ways between the two groups. And I think there, I can't speak with much confidence to it yet, but there we observe at least much more subtle answers, right? Because it's not vote Democrat or vote Republican, it's how are you dividing these 10 cents? So I hope I will be able to give you a better answer. You know, if I'm right about this valence aspect, we should see more of valence-like behavior there, because the choice is not as stark there. It's not a binary choice.
Yeah, thank you.
Costin.
Thank you for a great presentation, Professor Svolik. I have three small points, and so I'll start with the first one. The first one relates to your measurement of the treatment in a conjoint experiment, and you know whether you can talk more about the choice of those two items, because I saw you have something about civil servants or something like that. And I was wondering whether you see some heterogeneity, or whether you ask something about whether people like civil servants or something like that, because maybe I don't like civil servants, and this maybe just be conflated with my attitudes towards democracy. And the second point is about, you know, maybe just exploring some certain kind of effect heterogeneity. I don't know too much about the Turkish case, but I think this particular situation got a lot of attention in the international media. And I was wondering whether the subjects who are more internationally connected have a stronger reaction or something like that. Maybe this also is somehow connected with the profile of the voters and a different profile of different kind of parties. But I was wondering, whether you had the chance to explore a certain kind of heterogeneity in the effect. And my last point is about, backlash. And I think this is more of a theoretical question, whether backlash is, your specific mechanism of backlash is possible in contexts which are highly polarized as the one you are describing here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. These are excellent questions. And so on the items that we chose as our undemocratic platforms, I really tried to go by what happens in Turkey, right? So the kind of real world behavior, but crucially something that is possibly, that could also in principle be done by the opposition. Because in some scenarios, I also wanted opposition politicians to be endorsing something undemocratic. And so firing government employees who did not vote for our party when we, the opposition, comes to power, could be used by both sides, could be instrumental, and could be realistic if the opposition wins. But I don't think I do have a measure of one's attitude towards the civil service, for instance. But the way I try to get at, are these treatments really measuring undemocratic behavior, is that at the beginning of a long survey, I actually do ask people in this, what I call around the world battery. I on purpose tell them, somebody in a completely different country did this. The party fired employees, who did not vote for them. Do you think this is democratic or not? And so I know for each respondent how undemocratic they actually considered that action in a completely different context, not in Turkey, but in a completely different country. And I really think this is a good way to basically pre-measure the validity of that treatment. Effect heterogeneities are something that I would like to get more at, in part because in a separate paper, what we try to basically look at is when we take these conjoint experiments, as opposed to direct questions about support for democracy. First of all, do the same people that answer 10 out of 10 to questions like how important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically, are they actually the same people who in these two conjoined experiments are willing to switch their vote and vote for a more democratic candidate when it's inconvenient for them, partisanship-wise or policy-wise? And the rough answer is there is some correspondence, but it's very small. And we also see some factors that you would expect, like education, to be, to account for a lot of heterogeneity. Educated people do punish undemocratic behavior more. But for instance, not others, like income appears to have close to zero effect. And so we want to fully explore this in a separate paper where basically we want to write a methodological paper on, what can we tell from by now tens of thousands of conjoined experiments conducted about the validity of direct questions about support for democracy, and also about the covariates of support for democracy when measured by direct questions as opposed to conjoints. Now, how about backlash in a polarized environment? How about vote switching in a polarized environment? One of the striking things for me from Turkey, for instance, is that when I speak to survey agencies and I'm telling them I'm doing these, experiments, people will be choosing candidates that will have policies, party labels, they will maybe say something undemocratic. One of the most enjoyable parts is when I tell them this and they go back and say, oh, come on, in Turkey, people have already made up their mind. Nobody's going to switch their vote in Turkey. And by the way, they tell you the same thing in the United States, right? So, and they do switch, and they switch big time, right? So I just think survey agencies may not know their own voters well enough, at least not because they never run these candidate choice experiments. They only ask about real world candidate behavior, and that candidate behavior can be very stable for many reasons. But here we're interested in a particular cause and effect relationship, and that is, would doing something undemocratic, would that change your vote for a candidate? And actually, plenty of Turks are willing to change their vote. And we saw that in Istanbul, right? The first election, the AKP loses by 14,000 votes. The second one, 800,000 votes. I mean, that's no statistical accident.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of questions, because basically the message of this research is quite positive. I wonder, have you thought at all about how this might play out in multi-party systems? And my other question is, have you broken down the conjoint results by strength of partisanship? So would it be the case that those who are the strongest partisans were the most likely to abstain and the weaker partisans most likely to switch?
Mm-hmm. So to answer your second question, yes. So some of the graphs that I was showing, I think we're effectively doing that. So basically I was showing you graphs by approval for Erdogan versus Imamoglu. So that would be one measure of strength of partisanship. And then some of the graphs also showed at the neighborhood level by past vote for the AKP, which also you would assume that those were opposition versus government strongholds. And it's what you would expect, that you punish less if you are a strong partisan, but crucially, that the three mechanisms, backlash, vote switching, and disenchantment, also arise out of different partisan intensity segments. So the voters in the middle mostly switch their vote, opposition supporters mostly backlash, and government supporters mostly engage in disenchantment, with this last one being of the smallest magnitude. So disenchantment is fairly small, whereas backlash and vote switching account for most of the shift. Multi-party systems, I'm still, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, is that replicated though in the conjoint?
So somewhat, yes. So for instance, it's replicated in the order by partisanship that I gave you. So opposition supporters, backlash, government supporters, disenchantment, vote switching in the middle. It does not replicate in the magnitude of each effect. So for instance, in the real world data, we see a lot of backlash, a lot of vote switching, but very little disenchantment. In the experimental data, we see a lot of disenchantment, decent vote switching, very little backlash. I think the primary reason for that is that if you run a survey and if you ask people whether they would turn out, almost everyone will tell you they will turn out. And what the problem for that is that therefore in a control condition, the deck is already stacked against backlash, right? If you already in the control condition report a high turnout, detecting even higher turnout in a treatment condition is also already asking for a lot. Now about multi-party competition, so Turkey is a multi-party system, even though in this race, there was two primary coalitions, and that's how I treated them, competing against each other. I have not tried yet to think about what would be sort of conceptually the main aspect of multi-party competition that could be interesting here. One hunch I have, it could be, so think of the United States, if there were a second Republican Party, except that one was more democratic than the one that exists in the United States right now. So in a multi-party system, could it be that in Turkey we could have an AKP that is just as conservative, maybe has just as competent appearing leader as Erdogan used to be, except is behaving more democratically so that voters have a choice to switch to that party on policy grounds, where so they don't have to make such a sharp trade-off as voting for CHP, which is on the left and has many other attributes that AKP voters dislike, but happens to be, at least for now, more democratic, right? So I think that will be the key aspect, that we would observe spatially, partisanship-wise or policy-wise, more viable alternatives that would be pro-democratic and wouldn't ask as much of voters in terms of sacrificing to vote for the more democratic party. Another multi-party aspect that I think is also somewhat distinct to multi-party systems is that sometimes they have to form coalitions to defeat a strong authoritarian incumbent, right? So when you think about Turkey, it's already an alliance system, but even more, if you think of Mexico 20 years ago, right? It was everyone against the PRI. Or if we're thinking current Hungary, right? It's people have to unite to defeat Fidesz in Hungary. So the question is, so this is somewhat distinct, and that one I don't know how to take care of in a system, in a conjoint style experiment to take care of this coalitional aspect that is often needed on the side of the opposition.
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question. So, Jakir.
Hi, thanks. There's a lot to like about this research, but I guess I'm gonna let my negativity bias talk a little bit. So I have 3 main points that are quite related to each other. Did you consider about the candidate debates in between 2 mayoral elections? between the real election and the repeat election, because that's something Turkey hasn't experienced since the beginning of the 2000s. So that could maybe possibly play out for the vote switching or whatever happened. So that would talk to the exogeneity of your treatment, maybe. Like maybe that could intervene. I'm not sure. I just want to know how you see that. And for the second point, in your conjoint experiment, the question was like about the candidate, like hypothetical candidate in the district. Would you vote for this? Is this the mayoral contest or the national context? Because if it's national context, district candidates don't really matter to Turkish voters. They think about their parties when they vote. So I'm not saying they never think about the candidates, but it's less that way. So I need some clarification for that. And lastly, for the İmamoğlu, I think maybe, I'm not sure how you think if it would, these results would generalize to the national context, because, you know, in Turkish politics, leaders are very strong. Like people have a lot of attachment to the leaders. And İmamoğlu was a candidate who is especially really viable alternative for Binali Yıldırım, because he was very conservative as well. So he was a nice alternative for the voter base of AKP. So do you think that is why there's been some change between the repeated election and the real election? And how would you see the generalization of this to the national context? If it was, for example, Erdogan, would you expect the same thing or not? Because Turkish voters have a high tolerance for undermining democracy. And well, that's,
yeah,
I guess.
Thank you. Thanks for these questions. So I, you know, let me maybe start with the conjoint. And yes, so this was, the question was introduced by saying this is a candidate in your district. So it was implied that it's a legislative election. But crucially, as you could see from the slides, I on purpose provided minimal information. So in effect, I think when a respondent sees this, she's really voting for the party. Like you see AKP there, CHP there. You see these politically irrelevant attributes like whether the candidate is a lawyer or doctor, age, gender. And so I think I am ultimately mimicking in the vote choice, really party-based voting like it exists in parliamentary systems. So I would not be too much worried about, maybe the context I would be worried about, I guess, is that I'm saying this is a candidate in your district. In some conjoints, I describe them as being a former mayor, for instance. And that's only to introduce a valence attribute that's different from democracy, to say this is a former mayor under whose mayorship crime decreased or increased, to see how much Turks care about that as opposed to spatial issues. Because one thing that I'm after is to figure out how much is Turkey about valence, as in Erdogan is a competent leader, and how much is it about spatial issues, as in Erdogan is a conservative, right? And my suspicion is that the valence part may be way more important than the spatial issues, or at least the way people have been overplaying the sort of Islamist secularist conflict at the, you know, compares to how much his perception, at least until recently, his perception of being a competent leader. On the candidate debates, my problem with the real world case, as you would imagine, in addition to the candidate debates, is that even though it was only 3 months, a lot can happen in 3 months. Now, fortunately, nothing too big happened in those 3 months, but there was a debate between the candidates, right? And so I cannot eliminate that this is something that shaped the outcome. What I am spending a lot of my energy on is showing, for instance, that the economy did not deteriorate in the meantime enough to account for this, you know, 800,000 vote shift. And I can tell you by now, based on what I have, it would have to be an economic disaster of unprecedented proportions to actually account for this kind of shift. So basically what I did is I regress results in Turkish elections or public opinion surveys against economic performance, And there is a clear evidence of voting against the incumbent when the economy is performing poorly, but nothing of this magnitude. So I cannot eliminate that the debate made a difference. My sort of presentational strategy is focusing on showing that whatever this other thing would have to be, it would have to be huge. And that, yeah, it would have to be really, really unprecedentedly huge. How about generalizing to the national level? I think it's an important question. It depends a lot on, when it comes to the real world implications, it depends a lot on, you know, in the Turkish specific context, I think it depends a lot on personalities, right? So is Imamoglu going to be competitive against somebody like Erdogan? And I guess we'll have to see. And we'll probably see, right? So it's either my best guess, it's either the mayor of Istanbul or the mayor of Ankara who's going to be the next opposition candidate, because they both defeated the local candidates. But I think it shows something interesting when we think about democratization in general. In Mexico in 1988, the main candidate for the opposition was a former mayor of Mexico City and a former defector from the PRI. We don't know if he won in 1988 because the PRI insisted they won the election. We never saw there should have been a recount there. But it was a critical juncture in Mexican political development in the sense that the PRI, as a part of a deal, agreed to restructure its electoral administration to be never, ever again able to steal an election. And I see what happened in Istanbul as Mexico in reverse. What happened in Istanbul is that Erdogan tried to go where Erdogan has never tried to go before, and that is to overturn the result of an election. I see the Turkish status quo as basically, you manipulate what you can before the election, but when somebody votes, they have a choice to vote for a true opposition, unlike in Russia, and their vote is going to be counted. And I saw basically what happened as this was a direct message to the government, you've gone too far. You cannot you cannot ignore the result of an election. And so at least what I hope is that this last part, this strong pro-democratic instinct is something that actually probably stays with Erdogan, right? Like he heard a message. It's a huge embarrassment, right? To lose this big after already investing so much energy into the rerun. So that part I hope is going to translate to the national level.
Yeah, thank you. I do buy your arguments. It's an astonishing research. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, and I'll second that. We're at an end, and thank you. It's a really clever, fascinating study on something that really, really is important. We have a way traditionally of giving a little thank you to our guest speakers. Normally they have to do it in person so that we can embarrass them. But I think our center administrator is going to show you your gift. Wolf?
Yeah, I think I'm the perpetual embarrasser. I will send you a cup, and it has the poster of your presentation on it. I will email you either in the weekend or early next week to ask you for the address where to send it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the feedback and comments and suggestions.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I see hands.